What is going on, everybody? Star Wars Dad back for another video. Today we're going to be checking out kind of my deck building process and how I build decks. Before we get into today's video, please make sure to check out my Patreon for more exclusive content from me. And please make sure to like and subscribe on the video, as it greatly helps the channel to grow. And we are right around the corner from 5,000 subscribers, so make sure to sign up for the 5,000 subscriber giveaway. I greatly appreciate all this love and support, and all my Patreon members. You guys are awesome. So to get into today's video, I had a few people recently asking me how I build decks, so I figured I would do a video on this. And one of the first things you have to say about deck building is a lot of this comes from experience. I have been playing card games for like 30 years. I have a lot of experience with different types of games, played in a lot of tournaments, won a lot of tournaments, also have, gotten to like top eights and then kind of screwed myself over with different things from decks that I was playing, or improper deck building is a better way to say it. So there's been experience, both good and bad, that has helped me to be good at deck building now, and to, have built my processes over the course of 30 years, which is a very long time to be playing card games. So the first thing when you're looking at this game and how I go about deck building is the leader, right? I think, you start with the leader, right? What is the leader's ability? How impactful is their flip turn? What does their flip turn do? And what does their leader ability do? Because sometimes the leader ability can be really, really good, like a Bosk or like a Chancellor Palpatine, or Kylo. The new Kylo leader's leader ability is really strong. I really like Talzin's leader ability. I like Darth Maul's leader ability. But how good is their flip turn? So, like, what is this leader good at? It's the first question I ask myself. Like, what can I see this leader being good at? Like, when we talk about Palpatine and Kylo, we know that the leader is going to be good at cycling through the deck and digging for cards and being consistent. Consistency is always huge when you're building decks. When you're talking about like Sabine or Third Sister, you're talking about more aggressive builds. Like, they're going to be good at running other decks over, putting a lot of damage quickly. When you talk about Kira, that's going to be really good at removing threats from the board with Kira's ability and overwhelming barrage and all the other removal, right? So, that's a really important question to ask is, what is this leader good at? And start there. And then what does it synergize well with? Like, what are the cards that are in the game currently that have strong synergy with what the leader does? So like with Talzin, some of the new cards like Talzin's Assassin or Anakin do really well with that leader. Some of the new, Force synergy cards, of course, do really good with Talzin, right? When we look at Talzin, some leaders need a lot of Sentinels because you're trying to get to the leader. Like, maybe they flip late, like they flip on 6 or 7 resources, and you need to slow things down consistently with the combination of Sentinels and removal. And then, that's the next question. Early or late flip, like that really does matter. Like, if you're playing a leader that's late, you have to have a way to beat aggro, because aggro is automatically going to be your biggest weakness when you're playing a leader that flips on 7 or 8 resources, because they're going to be flipping on 4, maybe 5 resources. And they're going to be putting so much pressure on you that if you can't survive past 5 resources, you're never going to be able to play. So you have to be able to, identify what your strengths are with that leader and what your weaknesses are. For me personally, playing against aggro, because I used to be an aggro player, like when I played Magic. So I used to just dive in and just hammer out damage and hammer games online, like trying to win games in 3 minutes. And I did that for a while, and then it got really boring, because it is boring. Playing aggressively is a boring strategy. Which, it can be fun for a while, but at a certain point, it's just about jamming pressure. And it's like, that's definitely one way to play a game, but it's not the most fun way, in my opinion. What I'm saying is, I make sure that every deck that I build, the first thing I look at is, can it beat aggro? What does it matter if you can't beat a deck like Sabine? If you can't beat that deck consistently, if it's not even close to 50% of the time, then what's the point of playing that deck? If you're trying to win, at least. I mean, obviously, if you're just trying to have fun, then who cares? But if you're trying to win, you have to be able to beat a deck like Sabine, because there's still going to be a lot of players that play aggressive decks, and that's a multitude of reasons, right? Some people just like to play aggro. That's fine. Everybody likes different things. Some people are just getting into the game, and aggro is the easiest thing to pick up. Like I can pick up a Sabine deck. It's fairly moderately priced. It's easy to play. It's not like a huge learning curve on how to play it, and it has well-rounded matchups, right? So if I'm just getting into the game, that's a deck that I might choose. Uh, it's also been one of the initial decks that have been played in this game from the beginning of this game, so it's been around for a long time, and people are comfortable with it, and it's still very strong and still a big problem. So you have to be able to beat a deck like that. And so I mean, if you're playing a deck that flips later, then your weakness is going to be like, how do I get back past Sabine consistently? Because Sabine has a lot more tools now than it did originally, and it can beat me in space, it can beat me on the ground, it can still go over the top. Like I have to be able to beat that deck. And then, once you've identified those, then what's the impact of your flip turn? Like obviously, when we think about most impactful flip turns, you think of like Kira, Yoda, Kylo Ren. The new Kylo leader is really good. He can kill 2 units or take 2 units with capturing legal authority and craving power. So what am I trying to do? Like, how impactful is my flip turn? What's my goal with my flip turn consistently? Like if I'm aggro, do I want to be at a certain amount of damage consistently when I flip? Around 20 damage maybe per se. If with Sabine you want to be close to 20 on that 4 resource turn, right? Uh, if I'm playing a later deck like a Bosk where my flip turn may be delayed, or if I'm playing like Palpatine, what's my impact? Like what am I trying to do when my leader flips? How do I want the board state to be looking when I get to the point where I'm flipping? So these all matter. Like these are all really important questions when you're first looking at a leader. And for me, like I'm not really building decks just for fun most of the time. I'm building decks to be competitive. So I'm usually looking at, is this leader going to be competitive? Like, so if it's not going to be competitive, I'm probably not paying too much attention to it. Unless it has like a really unique ability that looks like a lot of fun, I'm most likely not paying attention to it. So my first thing is I'm just thinking like, is this leader competitive? What is this leader good at? Can it compete with the current decks? And that's a good place to start. All right, the next thing I'm looking at is like, what color am I pairing this leader with, right? My first inclination for most decks, for a lot of leaders, if they're not aggressive builds, if they're not aggro leaders, which I tend to build more decks that are more mid-range or control, then I'm going to look at blue first. Because blue just had, like, if you haven't noticed, if you pay attention to, like, just, if you go on Karabaster, Petronaki, there's always a bunch of blue decks. And there's a few reasons for that, right? Blue has some of the most powerful cards in the game, like Luke Skywalker, Avenger, Super Laser Blast, Vigilance. Then they have things like Rivals Fall, Takedown, No Glory, Fell the Dragon, just some of the best removal in the game. And then they also have like restore effects, like Top Target, Vigilance, restore units, right? So like what restore cards do in combination with all the good removal that takes out a lot of big threats is they help you to stabilize alongside those big pieces of removal when they're well timed. So for me, like blue is always the color I'm going to initially start with to just see how, if it's necessary, and then also just the removal is just so good. The only reason that I'm going to stray away from blue personally is if it makes more sense to play ECL, like if it's an ECL style deck like Kira, with Vader, like I might stray to ECL because of Vader, right? And the ability to just do such a good job of keeping things removed that I just can play like Vigilance, and I'm not too worried about my life total, right? Because of all the removal I have in combination with Vader and Kira's flip and overwhelming barrage, right? You could also play Data Vault, obviously, which is what we see right now everywhere, because why not get the extra, the 33 HP? If it pairs well with the leader in green, then it makes sense to have more HP, and you still have other ways to get restore, but maybe you're using maybe cheaper pieces of removal that are not as impactful, or maybe your leader already has blue in it, so you can switch to Data Vault, right? But if you haven't noticed, like pay attention, like the majority of the decks I see have blue in them, at least from my observation, but also from the way I play. I'm going to choose blue first, and that's because I don't want to lose to aggro. That's where this comes in, right? I want to have restore effects. I want to have good pieces of removal so that aggro cannot run me over, because it's not enjoyable when you're trying to play a deck that requires more thinking, more processes, more strategy, and a game that requires you to get to 6, 7, 8 resources. You need to have things like that built in, right? Now, if I'm playing aggro decks, I'm most likely I'm playing ECL. I mean, I might be playing yellow if I want to go surprise strike route, Millennium Falcon type thing, with the Sabine yellow, for example. But I don't, like I said, I don't typically build aggro decks. I usually just reference the ones that other players are using and test against those consistently, because I expect to see those and I want to be able to beat them consistently with a competitive deck. What type of removal? Again, if I'm gonna stray to red, where it's because I want to go for a more discard strategy with force throws and the new Jedi and hiding or pillage. But most likely, again, if I want consistent pieces of removal that I know are going to consistently be able to do what I need them to do, then I'm going to go blue. Again, we go back to strengths and weaknesses. What are the strengths and weaknesses of my leader? One deck I've been working on recently that I'll probably talk about, you use as a reference point because I'm still in the process of making this deck, is the Chancellor, the Chancellor Palpatine leader with blue, because of the new cards that it gets with Anakin and Vader and Xian Flurry. It definitely has some good strengths. Like, it can draw a lot of cards, it can gain life, it has good pieces of removal, but its weaknesses are still like that aggro decks, especially aggro decks when you get around 6 resources. They have a lot of like 6, 7 powered units, and then they have things like Surprise Strike and Hotshot Blaster, and that can be too much for a deck that doesn't have a leader that flips ever, because a lot of times that leader is that extra unit that can either play defense or put pressure on your opponent. But if you don't have an actual leader like you do with Chancellor, then your opponent has that inherent advantage against you. Another weakness of Chancellor Palpatine, of course, is that it's clunky sometimes. Like, you don't have the right card in your hand at the right time. And if you did have the right combination of 2 cards, then you would be fine. But that doesn't happen sometimes. So it's a tricky deck to build, because you have to inevitably give up some things that you want in there, because the consistency factor is already below average, because you're not sometimes you can't even play a card in that deck, which is not a good feeling when you're just sitting there at 4 resources and you're on the villainy side and you have no villain card to play, or you're on the hero side and you have no hero card to play. And so you have to find ways around that, and that's a weakness that is why that deck is not one of the best decks in the game. Because if that wasn't a weakness for that deck, I think that deck would be up there with some of the best decks, because the life gain, the pressure you get, the access to both hero and villainy is great, but that clunkiness and that inconsistency is what kills that deck. It shoots itself in the foot, right? But still, blue is the best color because we need those restore effects and we need that good removal to have a chance against aggro. Consistent game plan for aggro, right? So that's the last piece. Again, the first thing I'm doing when I'm testing a deck, and I'll just test it on force table, right? Like, I'm testing it like 50 times. I'm testing it for a consistency. I'm testing it so I can beat Sabine. If I cannot beat Sabine on force table, then I'm moving things around, and if I still can't beat it, then I'm either just not playing that leader, because if I can't beat AI, then that's a good reference point of like, okay, this deck's not even going to be competitive, because AI is not a good Sabine player. Like, compared to an actually very good Sabine player, like, so that's a good reference point of like, is this deck even worthy of testing against real people? Also, I can just get in quick games. I can see how the deck feels, things like that. So you have to have that consistent game plan for aggro. Do I need sentinels? Do I need early pieces of removal? Depends on what the leader is, right? So again, we'll use Chancellor Palpatine as our reference point. I have to have turn 1 sentinels. So the new Loth Wolf is good. Then I have things like Village Protector, Concord Dawn. Then I have Chilson. I have a lot of early sentinels to slow things down while I dig for my pieces of removal and set up my flips, right? As I get more and more cards in my hand to set up my flips so that I can more uh, consistently be able to do what I want to do around the 6, 7, 8 resource turn. The next big question is like, what is the goal of this deck, right? Is it an aggro deck? Am I just trying to get quick wins? Am I trying to put a lot of pressure on my opponent? faster than they do and just race them? Am I trying to just outvalue them with a more mid-range deck where I just have a lot better units at a certain point? I just have to kind of get to that 5, 6, 7, 8 resource turn and to start turning the corner and outvaluing my opponent, like with cards like Anakin and Vader and Luke. Or am I playing like more control where I'm just like removing, and then getting to like huge endgame cards where they're too strong, like Great Dragons and Avengers, to just kind of overpower my opponent while keeping their board empty? Or am I playing like more soft control, like Akira, where I'm using a mixture of removal, strong mid game presence like Kira's Flip or Vader ECL, and then going into a big end game of like Avenger and Devastator and things like that. So that's really important too, like because there's different ways you can play different leaders. You can play the same leader in different ways with certain decks. Like they don't always have to be played the same exact way, even if they're in a different color. So you do have to kind of identify like what goal are you trying to accomplish. Like with Chancellor Palpatine, I'm definitely trying to outvalue my opponents because I'm using all of those cards I just mentioned. I'm using Anakin, and Anakin with Shian Flurry and Chancellor Palpatine can easily get me a triple kill. It definitely can get me double kills. If I wanted to play the Qui-Gon's Ether Sprite, then I could get quadruple kills. And that was a card that I initially had in there to try to do that. But what I found is that you have to have three things in place, and that's something you might pull off once every 40 games. And to try to pull off that kind of combo is like, is it that good where it's worth keeping those three cards in there? Where I instead of Qui-Gon, I could be playing three pieces of removal, like two evacuates and two fell the dragons, and just take out something else. So you have to think like that, right? Like, and I definitely took out the Qui-Gon Ether Sprite because again, it wasn't happening, but once every 30, 40 games, and it's like that's not something that's that important to me. I mean, yes, getting -9/9 with Anakin and being able to ambush in Anakin on the same play is amazing. But if it's only happening once every like 3% of the time that I'm playing the deck, that's not enough to warrant a space for three cards when I'm just trying to survive typically around 7 resources because I'm trying to turn the corner and get to my Lukes and my Snokes or maybe my Laser Blast to just kind of stabilize, right? And yes, you can stabilize with that play, but again, you have to have Qui-Gon in play, be able to attack with it first, which means that you might not be able to remove another big threat because you had to attack with Qui-Gon's Ether Sprite first. So there's things like that you have to think about. And is it just a win more card, or is it even really necessary? And if the deck is consistently losing to aggro, which it was, I had to take that out. So things like that you have to consider, right? Like what's more important? What's a more important card in this slot, in that Ether Sprite slot? And for me, it was definitely Evacuate. Evacuate needed to be in there because there was too many games early on in testing against real people where they were just outpowering me with their mid-range powerful cards, and they'd already been putting pressure on me. So I was already behind in the race. So I needed a way to flush the game out and stabilize. And Evacuate does a good job of that, right? And then Laser Blast does an even better job of that a couple turns later. So, but that's an important thing to think about. Is like, how do we win? What's our goal? So with Chancellor Palpatine, we're winning by outvaluing our opponents with those Anakin plays, which we can still get double kills and we can still get triple kills with Shian Flurry. Um, we can still get double kills with Vader with Shian Flurry. We can still get double kills on 8 resources with Luke Skywalker and a Shian Flurry. So we're outvaluing our opponents. Then we're using cards like Snoke and Avenger to help us close the game out against certain opponents, right? Avenger's our big closer against a lot of decks after a Laser Blast. Snoke is a good, really strong card against a lot of decks that are trying to go wide, or just to like, if we're at a point where our damage is not too high, where we can just like lower everyone's power so that we can, start putting pressure on our opponent and setting up like cheap removal with their units being depowered by -2/-2. It also sets up cards like Luke to make things better, and Anakin's to make things better. So Snoke has a good synergy with Anakin and Luke as well, right? And Vigilance as well. So that's kind of I would put. I started more mid range with Chancellor Blue, and then I've kind of gone more soft control because I was having those consistency issues, and I needed one card to just be able to blow away the board for a turn so I could stabilize, draw more, and try to find more of the pieces that I need, right? The next thing for me that's really important is your curve, right? You have to be able to stay relevant. Again, I'm always thinking about aggro first because if I can't get over that hump, I can't even worry about the next humps that I have to get over. So I have to be able to stay relevant. Can't lose to aggro. That's the first thought. So I need to have relevant turn one plays, usually typically at least 10, but somewhere between 10 to 13, 14, depending on the deck. Like the Chancellor Palpatine deck, I'm playing a little more than 50 cards too because I draw so many cards that I need to have closer to 12 because I want to be able to consistently have that turn one hero card so that I can get that guy online and start drawing cards and doing my thing. Because I need to be able to draw cards to be able to find my consistency with that deck. If I'm not drawing the cards, then my deck's just going to be just like any other deck. And my advantage is that I get to draw and go back and forth, right? So I need to have at least 12 turn one plays in a Chancellor Palpatine deck. I would even say from some of the struggles I've had, I would even say closer to 13 is where I want to be. So I need to adjust that a little bit more. Early plays. So once depending on what deck you're playing, Sabine typically wants to have 12 to 14 turn one plays. They want to be able to consistently have something to put on turn one so they can put that pressure on you right away, right? Aggro decks, you might even have 15, sometimes 18, depending on the deck, turn one plays. Especially from a deck that goes wide, I might have 18 turn one plays with a lot of one drops, even in combination with my two drops, because I have a lower curve because I'm just trying to get the game over with quickly before my opponent gets to do their strategy, right? So a lot of consistent early plays. I want to have, going back to Palpatine, I want to have my 12 to 13 turn one plays. Then I want to have a good amount of turn two plays. Now, sometimes I might flip into power. Other times I might use Conqueror Dawn. Other times I might use Village Protector. I want to have consistent turn two plays. At very least, I can play another two drop, which is another reason why playing a little bit more two drops matters in this deck as well, because sometimes even on your 4 resource turn, if you're on Villainy, you can still play that 2-drop from Hero to play something from your hand at 4 resources, right? So I also want to be able to have cards that I can play that don't have either Hero or Villainy in them, like Takedowns, Fell the Dragons, uh, Vigilance. Another one is Geonosis. So I want to have cards like that I don't have to rely on the flip necessarily, and I can just play something that does something to the board that's impactful. Top heavy, that's a question I always ask myself because I don't like to be too top heavy because, again, that goes into consistency. Like if I have too many 8, 9, 10 resource cards in my deck and I draw too many of them early on, for one, I'm going to have to resource them. So I'm wasting them before they're even relevant unless I play tech. And then I also just want to not find them early on in the game. Like they're not, because for one, I don't want to resource them, and two, I want to have early plays. I want to be consistently doing something impactful to the board. I want my curve to make an impact on my opponent every turn. I don't want turns where I skip, and that's one of the big challenges with Chancellor Palpatine again, which is makes it a harder deck to build around because you can definitely screw yourself up and not have anything to play, and then your opponent's just getting to play 1, 2 cards, and that's a huge momentum swing if you don't play a card when they're doing that. And that's why a card like Evacuate is so important because that can really happen to Chancellor Palpatine a lot if things don't line up the right way. Like, especially if you flip over and the only hero card you have is the clone trooper that was made when you flipped from villainy to hero, and then they immediately kill it, then you now have no hero on board, and then you're back to trying to get a hero on board so that you can flip back to villainy. And that's where the challenge of this deck is, right? So it is definitely one of the harder decks to build in the game. But you don't want to be too top heavy again because you need to have those consistent heroes on board so that you can remove them even with Geonosis when you need to, so that you can flip. So, because that happens sometimes, I have to play like a 2-drop hero and then immediately exploit it with Geonosis for 3 resources, so that I can send something back, make an impactful play like a Waylay, and defeat one of my own heroes, so that I can flip to villainy if I had no heroes in play, right? So things like that you have to account for. But you don't want to be too top heavy, because early game you're just going to get run over unless you have really, really good early game plays that you expect to stick on the board, where you can fit more of those late game cards. That's kind of where the challenge comes into play, though, right? Depends on the leader. Like some leaders, you want to have more heavy cards like Yoda, because you want to be able to benefit off of Yoda's ability when Yoda flips. Um, but I think, again, that's where the sideboard is so important in those best of 3 matchups, because you're going to bring a lot of those heavier cards in against certain matchups, and you're going to remove them against the more aggressive opponents because you're not planning on getting to them, most likely. And then what are the win cons, right? Like, how am I winning with this deck? Again, if I'm aggro, I'm trying to run them over by 5 resources, ideally. If I'm mid-range, I'm trying to outvalue them around the 7, 6, 7, 8 resource turn, and then just kind of flip the curve in my game based on my flip turn and my powerful cards that I'm playing around 6, 7, 8 resources. And then just kind of flip the game in my corner, use Overwhelming Barrage to clear the board and keep the board empty while I continue to close the game out, right? Um, one of the decks that I think really it's like 3 different decks that I think is going to be very, very strong. As I've done more testing, I think Han2 Blue, Ray Red, and what was the other one? Anakin Blue. I think all 3 of those decks, like I said in my last video, they all got like 8 to 10 really relevant cards. I'd say like 7 or 8 of those are just really good cards that just make each of those decks very, very good, well-rounded. Each of them plays a little bit differently, but they play with a lot of the same cards. And they all have access to Force Throw, Jedi in Hiding, Pillage, the blue removal, the restore effects. They're just very well-rounded decks. I think you're going to see those 3 decks everywhere, because they also have very good curves too, with the addition of a lot of these cards that they got. So your curve is extremely important, so that because a curve is like the meat of your consistency, right? My consistency, I have choices and options each turn, and I'll just have one thing that I'm looking for. I have a couple of options each turn that I can play that can be very impactful to the board. All right, next up for me when I'm building decks is deciding on how much HP that the deck needs. So, in general, like aggro decks, you're going to be more likely to use a base with less HP, because you care less about your HP, you care more about how fast you go. So that's when you're able to use more like the bases that have more of the abilities and the lower HP, like ECL and Tarkin Town. Uh, Occasionally there's a mid-range deck here and there where it makes sense to use like an ECL. I think Kira is an example going into next set. I think some of the other villainy leaders potentially even as well could even use ECL. Gar Saxon, definitely. When I'm deciding what bases, I'm looking at, like, do I need the extra HP to develop my strategy? Sometimes Tarkin Town is better, like it was for Ray, for example, because you had a good amount of removal, you had a good amount of restore, and you had good pieces of removal. So it made sense to play Tarkin Town to remove early threats and just kind of slow the game down at your pace. So sometimes it does make sense. It really depends on the leader and what kind of abilities they have too. I think HP matters less when there's leaders that interact well with the opponent's units. Like a good example, for me, like the Darth Maul, the new Darth Maul, the new Talzin leader. Like, I think because they do such a good job of interacting with my opponent's units, that I don't think HP is as much the focus. It's more about the force synergy. So the 28 HP is fine, and I think that's kind of what they were going with when they were designing those cards. They had that in mind. But sometimes there's where Data Vault comes into play, or like Colossus. I haven't really been playing Colossus a lot lately. I really don't like starting with less cards in my hand, especially with Force Throw about to be like everywhere all the time. So I just don't think Colossus is going to be used that much. I think Data Vault will probably still be used a considerable amount, as people have become comfortable with the 60 card list. They've been doing really well with it. They like that extra HP. And I do think that extra HP matters a little bit, especially when you're playing more of a mid range type of deck. So, and then control, that's, where you might want to play Colossus potentially, especially if you have built in card draw and it's consistent. But I think that's where Data Vault has become the more popular choice for even control type decks, like Kira, like where's more like soft control, uh, because you don't have to, have a lesser hand size to start the game off with, and you still get to have the bonus HP, and then just Data Vault has been everywhere because it doesn't. It really, you're playing more good cards in your deck, and it really consistency is not that big of a difference from 50 to 60 when you're drawing 2 cards every turn. And I talk about that a lot in several videos that I've done recently, where I think that playing 60 cards sometimes is better than 50 in certain decks. But yeah, I mean, a lot of times I'm playing closer to the 30 HP bases. Lately, I've been focusing on building force decks, so I've been using the force bases to try to develop those synergies and figure out which ones of those leaders are going to be competitive and whatnot. But it really just depends on the leader, what makes the most sense. Obviously, force leaders need the force bases a lot of times. Typically, that's going to depend on what the leader is trying to do, and it goes back to that question of what am I trying to accomplish with this leader, right? Most of the time, that's pretty straightforward, but again, it gets into those questions of what color is the best too, and that kind of can lead you to different avenues of what bases to use. Chancellor Palpatine in particular, I think Colossus is not a bad choice actually for that deck because you draw so much. Um, but I still wouldn't feel great about it going into this set because of Force Throw and cards like that. Like heavy discard is just going to be a thing. Even with Jedi in Hiding is another card that just is going to feed that archetype. And like I said, I just feel like those hero red decks are going to be everywhere. And in my versions, I'm playing Force Throw, 2 to 3 Pillage, and I'm playing 3 Jedi in Hiding because why not? To have that additional synergy of discarding to mess with my opponent alongside my pieces of removal, alongside my powerful units. That's what makes those decks so good. So I just think that Colossus is really risky right now. I think it does make more sense for Chancellor in theory, but with the reality of things, I don't think I would play Colossus with Chancellor right now. I just wouldn't feel confident that that would work out, especially when the deck already struggles with clunkiness sometimes. So going back to that example. So next on my list, I think is one of the most important things is testing. Again, experience trumps everything. And for me, like I am constantly testing decks when I'm building them, like for days, sometimes weeks. Sometimes I go back and adjust things. Sometimes I evaluate other lists that have had success that are similar to mine and make adjustments based on how successful those lists were. I mean, just constantly tweaking. And I think that's what deck building is all about. It's just like constantly making little changes. Sometimes I'll be like thinking about it randomly about things I want to change or things that would have been better. Sometimes I've played in tournaments and I still think about what happened in those tournaments years later in certain matchups, and they'll come up from time to time, and I'll be thinking about what I could have done differently. And so I think that tweaking is just the way for me saying like constantly making little adjustments, subtle adjustments. When you make something that's starting to work and it feels consistent, it's got a good matchup into aggro. It has a good powerful mid game, and it has a good strategy to close the game out. Then it's just constantly tweaking things like what cards were really helpful, what cards were not. A lot of times I'm tweaking the sideboard because usually the main board is usually pretty good once I get settled on a deck, but the sideboard needs to adjust based on the meta, which is constantly changing. So, that's where a lot of my tweaking goes into play, but occasionally it'll be in the main board with certain cards, 1 or 2 things here and there, or maybe there's a card that becomes more relevant depending on decks that become more popular. But again, overall, number one is consistency. I want my deck to consistently do the same thing every time. Every time I play against it, I want to play with it. I want to do the same consistent general strategies. I want to see the consistent same cards. So a lot of times I'm playing 3 of just about everything in my deck. A lot of times I will play 51 cards and just play 3 of 17 cards. I want to do the same things over and over again. I do not want to lose to inconsistency, which is basically what Chancellor Blue suffers from, right? Like it suffers from shooting itself in the foot, which is why it's a deck that I would probably never play in a tournament. Now, again, this is early testing going into Legend of the Forest, and it definitely got a little bit of help. So that may my mind set on this deck may change, but consistency is number one for me. I want to do the same things over and over again. I don't want to lose because I outplayed myself or my deck didn't do anything good. I want to lose because my opponent beat me. If I'm going to lose, right? Because that doesn't feel bad. If my opponent beats me and I played my best cards, they played their best cards, and we did our thing, and maybe they got a draw here or there, and things worked out their way, whatever. But at least my deck stood a chance, and I was in the game. I want to be in every game, right? Which is why I like to play more decks that have balanced matchups across the board. And a lot of really good players will say that I want to play decks that have 50-50 matchups because I want to have a chance every game. I don't want to be just getting blown out of the water. There's sometimes it's a strategy that works where you just pick a deck that loses hard to one thing that's popular and try to avoid it. But I've never really been a fan of that. I want to be able to beat everything. So consistency is the number one factor when it comes to that. Like I need to be able to do those things. So I am constantly tweaking a list to make sure that it consistently does what I want it to do, and that I'm finding those turn one, turn two, turn three plays every single game. And that's where your curve is so important. And then of course, you know, the second thing is I need to be able to beat Sabine, like a deck like that, the aggro decks. I need to be able to beat them the majority of the time. That's one where I want to be better than 50-50 because a lot of players still play aggro. And if you run into that and you just get run over, it's like you never even got a chance to do your strategy. And that's just really not fun, right? Because it's like they're playing and you're just watching and you're just trying to stop from getting run over. And, it just feels like you're fighting against the current, like the current is going downstream and you're trying to go upstream, and it's just too powerful, and eventually you can't beat it. I don't like that feeling. It's not a good feeling. And so going back to, steps one and two and three and four, I'm making sure every step of the way that I have a good plan for aggro so that I can stabilize and turn the corner against them, or sometimes just destroy aggro. Absolutely, if I can find a deck that has well-rounded matchups and destroys aggro, that's going to be a deck I lean towards because aggro is a chunk of the meta that you always have to worry about. It's always going to be there. It always should be there to keep things in balance, especially control. But I want to be able to beat it since I'm not typically going to be playing it. So that's a big factor. Then I'm tweaking like different cards, trying different things out that might feel good. Sometimes, it might put a one of or a two of different things that do unique things at different times, or and see how they set up different lines of play. I'm trying to think of a good example. A good example with the Chancellor Blue list would be the Qui-Gon Ether Spray, right? Like it's a card that I tried out, and I was trying to do special things with the when played abilities of like Luke and Anakin to double those effects, right? And it's very cool when you pull it off, but again, the lines of play are very hard to consistently do that. And like I said, once every 30 to 40 games, it's not consistent enough for me to keep those cards in the deck. I'm constantly tweaking, constantly changing things. The deck is always evolving as things change in the meta. And then again, I'm doing 50 to 100 games of testing. Some of that's going to be on force table as I learn the deck and learn what it feels like, uh, and just kind of get over the hump of like being able to beat aggro against AI, and then also just making sure that the deck has that consistency factor. And then I go into testing against real people, and again, that's going to be a lot of testing too. And I want to be winning like 60% of the time or more, at least. If I'm closer to 80%, then that's amazing. But it needs to be, I'm very close to 60% at minimum, again, because I want to be in a place where my skill as a player, my ability to make decisions is what brings me over the top. I want to have the opportunity to be in that position and not just my deck my deck beats itself because I drew 5 2 drops and my opponent drew Emperor Palpatine and Snoke. I don't want to have those types of things be the reason I lost. I want to lose because we both were grinding, and it was sometimes it's just the luck of the draw, but I was in the game till the very end. I want to be close. And I want to win consistently though. So when I'm building a deck, that's the mindset. And that's why so much testing is needed. When I'm playing a deck for a tournament, like if I'm just focusing on one deck and I'm trying to just be the best I can be with one deck, I'm playing more like 300 games of testing. I know that sounds like a lot, but if you want to be an expert, like some of these players are with certain decks, that's how they get to that place. They get there because they're prepared against everything with that one deck. And that's a way that works for some players. And that's a way that works for me when I'm trying to be super competitive and win tournaments and just be an expert on one deck. So testing is extremely important. And then, another thing that happens with testing is, sometimes it'll work well, and then I'll get into live testing against real people, and then certain things will not work at all. Certain things that maybe in theory seemed like they would be good, or maybe they felt like they'd be better than they were, and they just aren't, or they're hard to pull off, like the Ether Sprite play with Chancellor Blue deck. So then I go back and I make adjustments based on what I see, or maybe I needed more early Sentinels because I'm struggling around the 4 or 5 resource turn against aggro decks. Or maybe I need more restore effects because the 30 HP isn't enough some games, and it feels like I'm constantly trying to push back and go upstream. So those are things that I'll tweak as well and go back and kind of start through this process again because I don't want to mess up consistency when I make changes. So the tweaks are always minor. If the tweaks need to be a lot, then that might be that the deck's just not good enough, right? Like it really depends on how it performs. Obviously, I want to be winning too. So if I'm not winning consistently, then it's not a deck that I want to play in a competitive setting, right? If I'm losing to a lot of the decks that are out there, then that's a big hint that maybe either I switch up the plan or I just change leaders if the deck's not even winning consistently enough. So a lot of different things go into testing, but that's where your familiarity, your comfortability come into play too. Like the more you get comfortable with the deck, the better you're gonna pilot the deck, and the better opportunities you're gonna have to have that winning percentage that's on the right side of 50 or 60, really. But yeah, I mean, typically I want to be winning at least 60% of the time with the deck, and I know that seems like a very strong percentage, but I'm not playing a deck if I'm not winning the majority of the time and it's not close to 60%. Then I won't play it. Then I won't play it. I'm only going to be playing the 2 or 3 decks that get me to that 60% or more win percentage. Next up is knowing your deck, and I think I just touched on that a little bit, but understanding the ins and the outs of the deck, that really comes with the testing. It's kind of one of those things that you learn as you go, and there's certain things you don't realize that certain cards do, and as you're going, you start to be like, whoa, I didn't realize that was that powerful. A perfect example would be Darth Vader, the new Darth Vader, right? Like I read the card, I looked at it, it looked very good. And then I played the card and I ECL'd and I killed a unit on the ground and I killed a big thing in space. And I was like, oh, wait, this is amazing. And then I quickly realized how broken it was. Like I already knew it was good, but then when you play it, there's a different understanding that comes with playing it. And then when you play it repeatedly and you see how repeatedly that card flips the game in your favor heavily, then I don't know why there's all these G's on here too. I was just looking at that. Then you really start to see how powerful the card really is once you've played with it against several different opponents, and you see like that it's the most important card in the deck. And then that when I'm playing ECL, I feel much more in control of the game than I do with Data Vault because of Vader. So like there's things like that I wouldn't have known until I played it. Looking at cards at face value gives you one piece of knowledge, but playing them and that experience just really changes your understanding of a card in particular. And then for your deck, getting in that 50 to 100 games, somewhere in that range, then you really start to have a good feel for the deck. You feel confident. You know what cards you're looking for in certain situations. You know what cards you don't want to see, how your deck functions. You start to feel comfortable. Like, I'm okay at 20 damage because I know that right now I'm about to flip the script and I'm about to take over with my restore units, and there's no way my opponent's going to be able to recover because they didn't get to 25 damage on my base. And once they get to 25, then I'm more worried. So there's certain things like that that start to innately feel better through your experience. Again, we go back to consistency. Does it do what I want it to do? And the only way you're really going to know that is if you get in, again, those 50 to 100 games. I want to fully understand my game plan for aggro and for control and what I'm doing in both of those. A lot of times my main board is built for aggro and my sideboard is built for control. That's mainly because you're going to see a lot more aggro decks than you are control decks, but that could very well change. And if it ever did, then I would shift it the other way, uh, where I would have my main board built for control and my sideboard built for aggressive decks. That would, but I don't see that happening in this game because it's a more unit focused game, but that could change. I mean, new cards could be printed, new strategies could be developed, the meta could adjust, and things could change. But that's kind of how I do things now. Is my main board is built for aggro because I want to win game one. I don't want to come out with a loss and have to win the next two games because that is a lot harder to come back from, especially after my opponent's sideboards. So I'm expecting to see more aggro, and that's one of those things that you got to build for what you expect to see to a certain extent. You definitely have to deal with specific problem cards. Vader is one of those problem cards that you're going to see everywhere, so you need to have a plan for it. You need to have good pieces of removal, whether that's Fell the Dragon, or No Glory, or Shatterpoint, or your own Vaders, or your own Anakin strategy that gets you the -6/6 with the hero villainy. Whatever it may be, you need to have a game plan for those cards. Can I handle a barrage? Can I deal with force throw? What's my plan for getting force throwed early on? Specific things like that are going to become really important when you're building. And then revisiting step 6, right? Like if I need to, if things aren't working out the way I'd intended, then I'm going to go back to testing and tweaking as I continue to get to understand and feel comfortable with what I have built. So with Chancellor Palpatine, going back to that example, again, from playing that deck, I don't think it's a deck that I would play in a competitive setting at this time. I do really like some of the things that it does, and when it works, it feels amazing. But a lot of times it doesn't line up perfectly, or my opponent plays good against me and doesn't allow me to have that clone die at the right time. It kills it before I get to flip back. I'm not in the right amount of resources to play the laser blast because I'm in hero at 8 instead of villainy. There's weird things like that that happen that make me feel like it's not a deck that I would play in a very competitive setting. It's more of like a locals, just play it for fun type of setting because it's still good, but maybe somebody will build a list that is that competitive and can win bigger tournaments. But again, that problem that Chancellor Blue has of shooting itself in the foot is always going to be there, and not having a leader at all. So, but one thing I will say is that after playing it enough now, I do have a good feel for the deck and the pace of play and just kind of like when to flip, when to not. Still not an expert on that because that's a hard thing to understand because it really depends on timing and the situation of the game. Ideally, you want to flip when the board is pretty empty or when your HP, you have a lot of HP left because you don't want to be doing that in a place where your opponent can rebel assault you for 10 damage and win the game, right? So you have to. That's where like the evacuates and the super laser blast come into play, and that's why they got added as I was building this list because they felt really important and allowing me to do those things when needed. So I can get to my end game and not be flippity floppying while my opponent is just hitting me in the face. And number 8, we get into like live testing against real people, whether that be online or in person at the local gaming store. So this is just kind of where getting more into like what I see from the deck. Like, do certain things, ideas that I had, did they work out? Again, that's like the Qui-Gon's Ether Sprite idea. doesn't feel good against live people. It feels inconsistent and lacks power. I think it might be something that's better with Qui-Gon the leader, but that's another leader that I really liked it in theory. Hasn't felt good in testing. Maybe somebody will come up with a list that feels better, but I just wasn't able to get Qui-Gon in a place where I felt like I could beat aggro consistently, and I think just that's a big problem to have. I felt like it was really cool when it started to get online and do cycle into Ahsoka and discard my opponent's hand over and over again and things like that. But it just there was too many things that could go wrong. That's another deck that was like an example. It did well in testing, felt like I got it to a consistent place, felt like it was decent going into aggro. Then I played against real people, didn't do well at all. It was very bad actually, and it was disappointing because I had high hopes for that deck, and maybe that's a deck that someone else will figure out, or maybe it's a deck that will get better as we get more cards. I hope because I love Qui Gon, but we'll see. But yeah, so how does the deck fare? How did it do? What were adjustments that need to be made? What cards were absolutely necessary? What cards maybe do I need more of? What cards do I need less of? What cards felt like they didn't do anything for me at all, or I just resourced them because they were never needed? That's where you kind of adjust it and add in things that give you more value. Maybe a sideboard card that needs to be moved into the main board is a lot of times what happens, and then cards that are maybe in your maybe board you add to your sideboard is typically how I do that. What were some of the weaknesses and what were some of the strengths? And then is it good enough to play competitively, or is it just a deck that's more for small tournaments or for fun? And that it really depends on how it feels. Like it's hard to explain, but when I feel the when a deck feels the best to me is when I feel extremely confident when I'm shuffling those cards and playing the deck. Like it's like I expect to win. That's when I'm like, this is a deck that I would play competitively, right? Now, if it's a deck where I'm like, yeah, I hope I draw into this card, maybe I'll have a chance. If that it feels like that's happening a lot, then it's might be something that's just for fun, or maybe it needs to be tweaked, or maybe it's just, you know, a better deck that's for small tournaments, right? It really depends on what kind of play you're trying to do. But really, the feel of the deck is really important for that confidence and that comfortability. All those things, once when you, like, for example, you take like a deck that's already well known and already established as one of the best decks. Like you take Kira Dataval right now, right? And you play that deck enough, and you're expecting it to be good because it's one of the best decks, but you don't have a lot of experience with it, so it doesn't feel comfortable, and you're losing with it still because your opponent knows how to play against it because they see it everywhere. You don't have a lot of experience. You're just playing it because it's the best deck or one of the best decks, and that lack of experience, that lack of testing, that lack of confidence and comfortability really makes a big difference because you're going to make misplays. You're going to not know the correct lines of play sometimes, or make the most optimal decisions. Maybe you don't know the ins and the outs of your deck, so you're not sure what cards you're trying to dig for or are best in certain situations. So all that stuff really matters. And that's why sometimes you'll see players that play like a deck that's off the wall. The one that comes to mind most recently would be not too long ago was a Grand Admiral Data Vault deck that somebody finished like top 25 at 800 people tournament, and you could tell that that player had been playing that deck a ton because when he played his list, he, everything made sense together, right? Like he had perfected that list and played it so much, probably I'm guessing at least 100 times, but I would guess closer to more in the 200 to closer to 300 range because the deck was so consistently good. When I play tested that and did a video on it, I didn't really change much at all and just kind of played his list, and it didn't take a lot of work. And I've played a lot of those lists, so my comfortability is not was not as big of an issue as someone else who's trying to play a list like that because of those blue green villainy colors are a deck type that I've played a ton of. But you still have to get used to the certain things and lines of plays that certain cards can do. that synergize with certain leaders, right? So the comfortability aspect and that play testing, that live testing, all that stuff really makes a big difference when you're building a deck in it, and it makes a big difference in your success with a deck. What makes me think of is when I used to play Pokemon back in the day. Uh, my buddy and I had come up with this kind of like an anti-meta deck, which no one was playing, which is always one of my favorite things to do is play a list that no one is playing and then bring it to a tournament. It was a smaller tournament, but still, and just like dominate, right? Because no one is expecting it. It's a deck that we focused on and built together and perfected it, and no one sees it coming, and I was extremely confident and comfortable with it, and I knew what matchups that I wanted to see and which matchups were a little more difficult, and I played really well and ended up winning the tournament. um, so that's kind of a thing that comes with that confidence and comfortability, right? And I think another time I did that, I played a complete off the wall deck and I got in the top eight. I ran into like my two worst matchups when I got to the top eight, but otherwise, I was undefeated. I was in first place going into the top eight, and I was doing crazy cool things and like having an awesome time. In Pokemon, you get six prizes, and I had one. It was actually against a guy who was a world champion. I took six prizes in one turn against him, and he did not. He was just so like I think he didn't even know what to do. He didn't even see it coming. Like it just kind of like I completely shut him down. He couldn't do anything, and I just sat there two, three turns in a row, and then I just set it up to where I could take all six prizes in one turn. So there's really cool things you can do if you do a lot of testing with a deck, and you can just that surprise factor is huge. Like when people don't know what to expect, you can really kind of win games if you're that confident and comfortable and perfected with your deck list because people don't know what to expect from you. And I'm sure that Admiral Data Vault deck had the same experience where a lot of people were like, I'm not sure like what everything he's going to be doing here. And I'm not sure the best way to play this because I haven't seen that much Grand Admiral being played. All I've been seeing is like Kira and Anakin and Cad Bane and Quinlan and all that. And then I get into this matchup against Grand Admiral Dataval, and he's doing all these really cool things and getting double death triggers, and so that's the thing that I really enjoy doing too. But that again, that comes from hours and hours of testing. If you want to perfect a deck that's not as popular, and I do think that that's one of the most enjoyable things about a card game is when you can find a deck that fits your play style, that is not what everybody else is playing, and because you're so good at it and you've played it so much that you can beat most of the meta and surprise them because that surprise factor is a big factor. So, but yeah, that Pokemon tournament that was probably whew, how many years ago was that? I don't know, maybe like 10 years ago, something like that. I haven't played Pokemon in a long time. Uh, so last but not least, I mentioned this earlier. It's just experience. That's going to be your best tool for deck building in the long run. Like a lot of these things that I wrote down and I've talked to you about today, these are things that I've been doing this for so long that I'm just naturally doing it. I'm not like going through a process. Although I do think that this process is going to be helpful and I hope it is for a lot of players. But for me, like that experience of just playing a lot of this game and other card games, but in particular the game that you're playing, like right now, all I do is play Star Wars Unlimited. There was a, a couple brief times where I went back to Magic for like a week or two, and I noticed that my play patterns and my misplays got worse in Star Wars because I was playing a different game. So like, if you really want to be the best at Star Wars, you really just have to play Star Wars, right? And I think it's an incredible game. So I don't, and I do think it's better than Magic. Magic is at a place right now where like the rotation is every 3 years, which is stupid, and it just keeps too many powerful cards in rotation for too long, and it becomes just like a win in 3 turns, and if your opponent finds this card by turn three, then you're probably just going to lose. And it's like it doesn't feel as skill oriented. It feels more just like who draws the most powerful combo or the most powerful card by the third turn a lot of times. and it doesn't feel very skill oriented. It feels more just like luck based, especially because in Magic you're only drawing one card per turn, and card draw in general is huge, right? That's one of the biggest things in Magic. In this game, we're drawing more cards uh, initially with the two cards every turn, and then we have built-in mechanics for card draw that are pretty sweet. But card draw is not as impactful as it is in Magic. It's not just like top deck mode, and there's not as many broken cards, right? Like there's not like turn three the game's over, like which I like about this game. I don't want this game to ever become like that because that takes no skill. And what's great about this game is your opponent makes a decision, then you react to their decision and make your own decision. They react to you. That's a much more healthy way of playing a card game than you sitting there watching your opponent do something on their side of the board for 20 minutes while you just go to the bathroom and eat a cheeseburger and then they're finally done with their turn. Like that's just not a to me that kind of gameplay just got old after a while. I love some of the mechanics of Magic, but that was one of the things that I really kind of took me off that when I found this game. I haven't really looked back. I miss a little bit of the combos that you can do, but I don't miss the turn three you lose for no reason just because your opponent drew the right cards and you didn't. So, but I think playing in tournaments is the only way you're going to get better in tournaments. Is whether you lose or you win. Either way, it's a good experience because you're learning what to do and what not to do. I still think about one of my worst misplays in like a big regionals tournament in Pokemon sometimes, and it was just such a subtle thing. It was like uh, I can't even remember what they had. What are they called? Um, Pokemon stadiums that you can play, which are like things that affect the entire board state for both players. And the player that I was playing against, he put it to the side instead of in the middle. You're supposed to put it in the middle, but I wasn't paying attention. I was just playing, and I was like one win away from making the top 32 of like a 600 player tournament. And he put it off to the side in between like our deck piles of like our 50, 60 cards or whatever, and I didn't see it. And so when I went to go to my turn, I didn't see the stadium was still in play, and it ended up costing me the game, and we ended up tying instead of me winning because I didn't see that stadium. I ended up doing something that allowed him to get back in the game, and then he was able to flip it and win game two, and then we went to time, so we tied. And I always think about that because it was such a silly thing. Like if I had seen that, I would have known not to do something that I did. That experience, it was valuable because I did well, but I didn't make the top 32. But then I realized like I need to pay attention to certain things on the game table and make sure that my opponent does what he's supposed to do. And because it was my fault just as much as his for not putting it in the middle because I should have said something and should have noticed it. And then also just being aware of everything that's going on more or less, taking your time, not just playing too fast. Because one of the things that can happen too for me that I learned as a player is that when I'm confident and sure of myself with the deck, sometimes I play too fast. And when I play too fast, sometimes then I make a mistake because I don't see something that I should have seen. And that's because I get almost like a little overconfident. So that's something that you're only going to learn these types of things from tournaments. Bad beats, that's another way to learn, unfortunately. Again, that's the consistency thing. Like when I've lost to dead draws where I just draw nothing and just watch my opponent play, and it's no fun at all. I'm just sitting there doing nothing and they're just winning the game, and it's like, why am I here? So that's another reason where consistency has become so important to me in deck building, and that lack of consistency is one of my least favorite ways to lose because it just means that my deck beat itself, and I didn't even get a chance to see if I could match up against my opponent. So that's why I can't stand that. So if any decks that you see me build, consistency is going to be a huge factor, if not the most important factor in the deck that I'm building. It may not be perfect, but it's going to be the biggest factor in my deck building. And then again, losing is it's the best tool to success, right? Like you got to lose sometimes. Like losing lets you see where your weaknesses are, right? I think don't look at it as losing. Look at it as I'm finding the chinks in my armor. I'm finding where my weaknesses are through through this testing and through these tournaments and all that. I'm finding where my weaknesses are with my deck and then as a player. So experience is the best tool for sure. Definitely ask me any questions that you feel like you need to. Want to see me do more decks about gameplay or deck building, or if you have any questions about deck building, feel free to ask. I'm definitely more available on my Patreon as I check that all the time. So if you want to be a part of my Patreon, I greatly appreciate it, and I respond right away on Patreon to anyone who asks me questions throughout the day, and I help people with their deck building as well. So keep that in mind. But hope you guys enjoyed the video, and as always, y'all have a good one, and peace out.